The fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric prayer above the third-floor corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, Norfolk. Elena Martinez moved through them like a ghost at 2:07 a.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that still smelled of the bleach she'd used to scrub down room 312 an hour earlier. 3 weeks on the night shift. 22 days of keeping her head lowered, her hand steady, her voice smaller than it needed to be. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and something else she couldn't name, the particular exhaustion that only exists in the hours when most people are sleeping and the dying work their hardest to stay alive. She'd chosen the night shift deliberately. Fewer eyes. Fewer questions. Fewer people who might recognize the way she moved through a room, the particular precision of someone trained to work under fire, to triage in the dark, to make decisions that held lives in the balance of a single second. The day nurses at Oak Creek Memorial were competent enough. The attending physicians were solid. But the night was hers. The night was always hers. Room 347 was at the end of the hallway, past the supply alcove and the abandoned crash cart that hadn't been restocked since 1997. Elena checked the patient monitor first. The ritual was always the same. Heart rate steady. Blood pressure acceptable for a comatose state. O2 saturation holding at 94%. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm like something tired and old, the tube taped to his face after 2 years of doing the breathing he no longer could do himself. She made notes in his chart without looking at his face, a habit she'd formed 3 weeks ago when she'd first seen him. Admiral Vincent Cross. The name had been there all along in the medical record, typed in standard hospital font, unremarkable. She'd walked past room 347 4 times before her hands had stopped shaking enough to read it clearly. The Admiral lay motionless beneath a hospital blanket, his body the color of old paper, his chest rising and falling to the rhythm of the ventilator. 2 years. That's what his chart said. 2 years and 14 days since he'd opened his eyes. His grown children visited every other Sunday. His wife had stopped coming after 8 months. There were no flowers on his bedside table, no cards, no photographs except for one, a young man in naval dress whites, positioned where the Admiral's left hand could almost touch it if he could move. His son, probably. Elena didn't let herself think about sons for very long. She adjusted the 4-line running into his left arm, checking the placement with the unconscious precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. 1 stick. That was the standard. She'd never needed 2. The veins presented themselves to her hands like they were cooperating, like her touch was something they recognized from another life, another uniform, another set of circumstances that existed in the classified files and the sealed courts-martial records that followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. It was during the routine belongings check that everything shifted. The jacket hung in the small locker beside his bed, navy blue, expensive wool, the kind of thing an admiral wore to official functions in a life that no longer existed. Elena pulled it out carefully, checking pockets as protocol demanded, making sure nothing had been left behind. A pen. 2 quarters. A receipt from a dry cleaner dated November 2022, before he'd stopped existing in any meaningful way. And then she saw it. The unit patch was sewn into the jacket's lining with careful, deliberate stitches, positioned where only someone who knew to look would ever find it. Faded. Worn at the edges where it had been touched 1,000 times by hands that needed to remember something. The insignia was barely visible now, the ghost of an image that meant everything or nothing depending on who was looking. Elena's hand stopped moving. Her breath caught in her throat. She recognized it. Not because she'd studied it or memorized it, but because she'd worn it. The same patch on her uniform. The same unit that had sent her to Bagram. The same command structure that had decided her career was expendable. She held the jacket still, her fingers tracing the stitching without pressing too hard, afraid that too much pressure would make it real. The Admiral had carried this. Had sewn it into his lining. Had kept it close to his body for years before a moment on a tarmac had stopped him cold. She had no idea what moment that was. The records were sealed. The investigation was classified. What she knew was that she'd made a triage decision on a Tuesday in August, and that decision had cost someone's son his life, and 4 days later, this man, Admiral Vincent Cross, had signed the papers that ended her career. The doorway darkened. Elena's hands moved before her mind caught up, folding the jacket with the patch hidden again, turning to acknowledge the figure in the threshold with the practiced deference of someone who had learned to make herself smaller in professional spaces. Dr. Marcus Ashford stood with his arms crossed, his posture carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never been wrong in any way that mattered. 43 years old. 18 years at Oak Creek Memorial. 3 previous nurses on the night shift before Elena, and none of them had lasted more than 6 months. He wore the kind of cologne that announced itself before he entered a room, something expensive and aggressive, a smell like a luxury car after it's been freshly detailed. His eyes moved from Elena's face to the jacket in her hands, tracking the motion with the clinical attention of someone trained to observe. Everything intact. His voice was calibrated, professional, the kind of tone that could cut without seeming sharp. Yes, doctor. All belongings accounted for. Elena kept her gaze level but not challenging, a technique she'd perfected over the course of 743 days since her discharge. Visible but not threatening. Present but not intrusive. The way a ghost would stand if it had been trained in protocol. He watched her for 3 more seconds, the kind of pause that existed between heartbeats, the kind of silence that had weight. Then he stepped into the room and moved to the Admiral's beside with the easy confidence of a man who owned the space he occupied. His hands moved across the monitors with the precision of someone competent but not exceptional, checking readings that Elena had already verified, confirming what was already true because the ritual of confirmation was part of what doctors did to remind themselves they were in control. 2 years, he said, not to her but to the Admiral, the way doctors sometimes spoke to comatose patients as if they could hear redemption in the medical facts. 2 years and we're not seeing any improvement. The brain scans are stable, but stable isn't progress. He turned back to Elena, his expression settling into something that might have been curiosity or might have been something else. You know, we get a lot of veteran hires. Good workers, mostly. Strong work ethic. But they've usually got complications. I don't have complications, doctor. Everyone has complications, Miss Martinez. It's just a matter of what kind and how well you hide them. He moved past her toward the door, his presence making the small room feel smaller. Keep an eye on his foresight. The last nurse missed an infiltration that cost him 3 weeks of healing. Try not to repeat that. When he was gone, Elena set the jacket back in the locker and stood alone in the dim light of room 347, the Admiral's ventilator continuing its steady mechanical rhythm, the heart monitor continuing its patient beeping. She could hear her own breathing now, controlled, measured, the way she'd taught herself to breathe in spaces where being heard felt dangerous. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time she left the room. They always did. That was the thing about discipline. That was the thing about surviving. You learned how to make yourself very, very still. She moved through the rest of her shift with the careful efficiency of someone trying not to be seen, checking vitals, adjusting for lines, documenting observations in the electronic medical record in the kind of precise, technical language that left no room for personality or history or the fact that there was a woman inside the nurse's uniform, a woman with a rank that no longer existed, a woman who had sewn her own unit patch into the lining of a jacket that she'd burned in a barrel behind. Her apartment in September, watching the fabric turn to ash and feeling nothing except the particular cold that comes from being unmade. The clock in the corridor read 5:19 a.m. when Elena finished her charts. The sun was beginning to suggest itself outside the east-facing windows, the sky moving from black to the deep blue that comes just before dawn. She was walking toward the supply room to restock the crash cart when she heard something that made her pause. A sound like a key in a lock, a door opening behind her? She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She recognized the absence of his breathing before she heard his footsteps, the way the air moved when the Admiral, when anyone she'd known from before, occupied the same space as her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Ashford's voice followed her down the hallway, soft and measured, speaking into his phone as he walked, words that drifted backward like smoke. Yes, I see it. The patch in the jacket. Military background. Fits the profile. A pause. No, I don't think she knows. But we'll see. Elena kept walking. She kept her hand steady. She kept her breathing controlled. The supply room was 15 feet away. The crash cart was overdue for restocking. There was work to be done, and the work was all she had left, and the work would have to be enough. The overhead page crackled at 7:15 in the morning. Elena stood at the nurse's station restocking the crash cart, her hands moving through muscle memory, airway equipment in the first drawer, medications in the second, defibrillator pads in their sealed packets. The voice that came through the speaker was Dr. Ashford's, syrupy with contempt, ensuring every corner of the third floor could hear. "Can we get Pollyanna to room 212 for a clean-up?" The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. Two nurses at the far station exchanged glances, quick, knowing, the kind of look that said they'd already decided whose side they were on. Elena set down her clipboard without a sound. Her jaw tightened exactly once. That was all. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from 3 tours in Helmand Province where showing reaction meant showing weakness, and walked toward room 212. The room smelled like antiseptic and something else beneath it, the particular staleness of a body that hadn't moved in 2 years. She changed the bed linens with mechanical precision. Corner to corner. Hospital corners that would have passed inspection at Walter Reed. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who couldn't hear the whispers that had started at the nurse's station, someone whose reputation wasn't dissolving in real time like sugar in water. She didn't think about the unit patch still hidden in her locker, folded inside her jacket lining. She didn't think about Dr. Ashford watching from the doorway, his expression like a predator testing the fence of a cage. That afternoon, the supply closet became a trap with walls of gauze and saline. Elena was restocking the crash carts when Dr. Ashford blocked the entrance, his silhouette against the hallway light turning him into something abstract and menacing. His voice came low, almost intimate in the narrow space between the metal shelves. "I saw you going through Admiral Cross's personal effects. That's inappropriate interest in a patient's belongings. Makes me wonder what else you're doing when no one's watching." The air pressure in the supply closet seemed to drop. Elena could smell his cologne mixed with the chemical bite of hand sanitizer. She met his eyes without flinching, without the courtesy of looking away first. Her voice came out flat and even, the voice of someone who'd already decided the cost of this moment and found it acceptable. "I was completing the belongings inventory per protocol, Doctor. It's documented." He leaned closer, close enough that she could see the small blood vessels in his eyes, the particular cruelty that lived behind expensive features and expensive educations. "Is it? Because I could have your nursing license reviewed. One call to the state board. One conversation with the hospital administrator. You understand how fragile new careers can be? Especially one starting in the ruins of old ones." Elena didn't move. She didn't step back. She stood in the narrow space between shelves like she was standing in a field hospital under fire, like she was holding a surgical kit and a prayer, like she'd already survived things that would have broken ordinary people. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, without giving him the satisfaction of looking away, without granting him the victory of her pain. "I wonder what the medical board would think about a doctor who's more concerned with protecting his reputation than his patient's recovery." Dr. Ashford's face went very still. The smile he'd been wearing froze and then faded like a photograph left in the sun. He stepped back. "We're done here." But they weren't done. Not by a long measure. That evening, as the night shift began arriving through the parking lot entrance, Dr. Ashford found Elena at her car. The transfer notice was in his hand, crisp and official, and he held it out like an executioner's warrant while 3 nurses watched from 20 feet away, close enough to see, far enough to pretend they weren't looking. His voice was loud enough for all of them to hear. "Ms. Martinez is being moved to the psychiatric wing effective immediately. She needs a setting more suited to her capabilities." Elena took the paper from his hand. Her fingers didn't tremble. The paper didn't shake. She read the transfer notice with the same steady attention she would have given a medication order, a patient's chart, anything clinical and contained and survivable. When she looked up, her composure was a wall made of reinforced steel, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst and finding it didn't kill her. I wonder what the medical board would think about a doctor who's more concerned with protecting his reputation than his patient's recovery. The same words, delivered differently. This time they landed like a blade finding a gap in armor. Dr. Ashford's jaw clenched. He turned and walked back toward the hospital entrance, his movements sharp and angular, the body language of someone who'd expected capitulation and received defiance instead. One of the arriving nurses, a woman named Sarah who Elena had worked with twice, met her eyes across the parking lot. There was something like respect in that look. Or maybe just acknowledgement that Elena had shown up wounded and refused to bleed where anyone could see it. But the transfer notice was real. The reassignment to the psychiatric wing was real. And everything Elena had begun to notice about Admiral Cross's care, the medication reductions, the stalled recovery, the charts that didn't match the recovery timeline from 2 years ago, was slipping further out of reach with every shift that passed. That night, Elena moved through her new assignment on the second floor like a ghost. Psychiatric recovery wasn't critical care. It was routine checks, medication administration, charting that didn't require the kind of focus she'd been trained for. Post-surgical recovery meant patients waking up from procedures, confused and medicated and not in immediate danger. She completed her rounds with the same precision she'd brought to every task at Oak Creek Memorial, but her mind was in room 347 3 floors above, where Admiral Vincent Cross lay in a state that had never made sense, where the medication he was receiving had been systematically reduced over 6 months in increments small enough to evade automated safety alerts. She'd photographed 3 pages of his chart the night before, the original neurologist's protocol from 2 years ago, and the current orders that showed dosages reduced by 0.3 mg decrements every 2 weeks. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that would trigger an alarm. Just enough to ensure that whatever damage had been done to the Admiral's brain remained permanent, that whatever secrets he might carry when he woke up would stay locked away in the darkness of his unconscious mind. But Elena was no longer his assigned nurse. Elena was in the psychiatric wing now, processing transfer paperwork and helping patients navigate the chemical haze of recovery, watching the clock until her shift ended and she could drive home to her studio apartment and pretend that the transfer notice didn't mean what it clearly meant. The next shift, she requested a conversation with the charge nurse about the medication discrepancies in Admiral Cross's care. Within an hour of that request, Dr. Ashford had called the scheduling office. She was moved to day shift. Her 3-week rhythm of night work, the pattern that had allowed her to see the Admiral every single night, to notice what was happening in the darkness when the attending physicians weren't watching, was broken. Shattered. Replaced with daytime hours that kept her in different parts of the hospital entirely. When Elena arrived for her first day's shift, Dr. Ashford was waiting at the nurse's station. His voice was professional now, stripped of the contempt he'd shown in the supply closet and the parking lot, replaced with something colder and more systematic. "I've restricted your access to ICU patients pending review of your performance. You'll be working post-surgical recovery on the second floor. We need to ensure your nursing practices align with hospital standards." Elena felt the isolation like a physical thing, like a hand closing around her throat. She'd seen something in the Admiral's chart that someone very much did not want seen. She'd noticed medication reductions that made no clinical sense. And now she was being systematically removed from access to anything that mattered, pushed into corners of the hospital where she couldn't help, couldn't observe, couldn't interfere with whatever plan Dr. Ashford had set in motion. That night, she entered the hospital through the emergency entrance during a trauma intake, riding the current of a stretcher and paramedics and the controlled chaos of an incoming patient. She had to see the chart. She had to confirm what she suspected. Her badge was swiped into the 3rd floor before anyone could flag her credentials, before anyone realized that a day-shift nurse in post-surgical recovery had no business being in the ICU at 8 o'clock in the evening. Room 347 was 3 doors down from the nurse's station. Elena could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, the steady beep of the heart monitor, the background hum of equipment keeping a man alive who someone very much wanted to stay unconscious. The medication pump glowed soft blue in the darkness of room 347. Elena stood at the Admiral's bedside at 3:17 a.m., the night shift moving slow and steady around her, and her eyes fixed on numbers that didn't add up. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, hold, out, a sound she'd heard 10,000 times in a different life, in a different uniform. But these numbers, these were wrong. She'd been watching the charts for 3 weeks, documenting everything in the small leather notebook she kept in her pocket, the one with her old unit insignia faded on the cover. Tonight, she'd pulled the full medication history. 6 months of data. She traced her finger down the dosage column, watching the numbers descend like a staircase, not in sudden drops that would trigger alarms, but in increments so small they looked like routine adjustments. 0.5 milligrams reduced. Then another 0.4. Then 0.3. Calibrated. Deliberate. The work of someone who understood exactly how much you could lower a dose without triggering the automated safety protocols. The Admiral's chart showed he should be on a specialized neurorecovery protocol, a medication regimen designed specifically for traumatic brain injury patients. The original prescription from 2 years ago had been clear, 12 milligrams every 8 hours. But what Elena saw now was 4.8 milligrams. 40% of the therapeutic dose. Enough to keep someone sedated. Not enough to promote consciousness. Not enough to allow the brain to heal. She photographed each page with her phone, her hand steady as surgical steel. The camera clicked silently. She moved methodically through the chart, admission notes, follow-up assessments, neurological evaluations. Everything documented by Dr. Ashford himself. Everything showing the same pattern. The medication reduced incrementally, quarter by quarter, month by month. A perfect staircase descending into unconsciousness. Elena looked at the Admiral's face. His skin had that papery quality of 2 years without sunlight. Tubes ran from his nose and throat. Monitors tracked his vitals in green and white numbers that told a story of a man trapped in suspension, alive but not living, breathing but not waking. And she thought about that unit patch. The faded insignia sewn into his jacket lining. The one Dr. Ashford had seen her examining. The one he'd threatened her over. The patch matched her own. Same unit. Same 2nd Battalion, same Charlie Company. And that's when it crystallized, the connection she'd been circling without naming it. The court-martial 2 years ago in Bagram. The classified hearing. The triage decision that had cost an officer's son his life. The same officer who had testified against her. The same officer who sat in a coma now, kept under by someone who clearly knew exactly what waking him would mean. Elena pulled up her encrypted access, old credentials that never quite deactivated, military medical clearances that lingered in the system like ghosts, and cross-referenced the Admiral's service record with her own. There. The connection. He'd been the senior officer in her unit when the court-martial happened. He'd been the one who could have stopped it. He'd been the one who'd let it happen instead. And now someone was making sure he never woke up to tell anyone why. The heart monitor beeped steady. 62 beats per minute. Normal. Acceptable. The oxygen saturation held steady at 94%. Everything appeared stable. Everything appeared normal. And that was the elegance of it, the absolute clinical precision. Keep him alive. Keep him unconscious. Keep him away from any moment where consciousness might return and force accountability. Elena closed the chart. She walked back to the nurse's station where the fluorescent lights cast everything in pale, sterile white. The night shift was quiet, just another nurse charting at the computer, an aide restocking supplies down the hall, the soft beep of monitors from a dozen other rooms. She sat down and opened her secure email access, the one linked to her old JG officer contact from her discharge paperwork. She began typing a query about classified medical records, about the Admiral's neurological status, about whether there had ever been any investigation into his care protocols. She hit send at 3:42 a.m. Then she went back to room 347. The Admiral lay exactly as she'd left him. The same grey pallor. The same mechanical breathing. The same steady heartbeat that meant nothing if it never led to consciousness. Elena pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, doing something no protocol allowed. She sat in the dark with him. Just watching. By 4:15 a.m., the reply came through on her secure phone. One line. A JG contact she hadn't heard from in 18 months, probably still on active duty somewhere, probably still with access to files that technically didn't exist. The message read, "Medical review flagged concerns." Sealed. Request came from Naval Special Operations Command. Something there, but classified above your clearance. Elena turned her phone off. She understood now. The Admiral knew something. Something important enough that someone in Naval Special Operations had flagged his case. Sealed his case. Made it disappear into the bureaucratic machinery where inconvenient facts went to die. And Dr. Ashford, somehow Dr. Ashford had learned about it. Or had been told about it. Or had been paid to maintain the silence that kept the Admiral unconscious. She thought about the transfer notice in her locker. The one that would move her to the psychiatric wing starting tomorrow. Away from this floor. Away from this room. Away from any chance of discovering what was really happening here. The night moved toward dawn. Elena stayed at the bedside, watching the medication pump and its glowing numbers, understanding now that every milliliter of fluid entering the Admiral's fur line was another grain of sand in an hourglass counting down to permanent unconsciousness. She thought about the protocols she'd used in combat. The catastrophic traumatic brain injury patients in Bagram. The ones given a single chance at survival through experimental stimulant combinations that bypassed the standard recovery timeline. The ones she'd saved using methods that never made it into official medical literature because they existed in the spaces between military medicine and battlefield pragmatism. She had access to the pharmacy. Old credentials again. Military medical classification. A system that didn't know she'd been discharged, that still saw her as Major Elena Martinez with valid access to restricted medications. She could do it. One vial. One injection directly into his port. Enough to spike his neurological activity. Enough to potentially wake a brain that had been kept in chemically induced hibernation. Enough to break whatever silence Dr. Ashford was protecting. But that wasn't yet. Not tonight. First, she had to document everything. First, she had to be certain. First, she had to make sure that when the Admiral woke, if she did this, when the Admiral woke, there would be evidence that his medication had been deliberately reduced. Evidence that Dr. Ashford's actions were not medical care. They were something else entirely. Elena stood up at 5:03 a.m. She walked back to the nurse's station. She pulled the complete medication logs one final time and began printing everything. Page after page. 6 months of systematic reduction. 6 months of deliberate denial of recovery protocol. She carried the papers to her locker and buried them beneath her scrubs. Evidence. Insurance. Ammunition. When Dr. Ashford arrived at 6:15 a.m. for rounds, Elena was already gone, transferred to the psychiatric wing as ordered, removed from room 347 as intended. But what she'd left behind was a photograph in her phone of medication discrepancies that would eventually be discovered. A digital trail of her inquiries about classified medical records. And most importantly, an understanding that had crystallized in the darkness of a hospital room where a Navy admiral lay suspended between life and the elaborate fiction of care. Someone wanted him unconscious. And Elena had just decided that wasn't going to happen. Not anymore. Not if she had anything to say about it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she now understood what happened next would destroy everything. Her career. Dr. Ashford's career. The entire careful structure of silence that had been built around Admiral Vincent Cross. And she was about to light the match anyway. Tuesday night at 3:17 a.m., the ICU was a cathedral of silence. Elena stood at Admiral Vincent Cross's bedside in room 347, monitors casting pale blue light across her face. His brain activity traced across the screen in shallow peaks, better than the flat line of 6 months ago, but nowhere near the pattern of a man capable of consciousness. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. In and out. In and out. Steady. Insufficient. She checked the medication pump mounted beside the bed, the one Dr. Ashford had personally programmed during his evening rounds. Elena's eyes tracked the infusion rate, 2.3 milliliters per hour of the specialized neurological stimulant protocol. She calculated backward through her notes, cross-referenced against the standard dosing for traumatic brain injury cases. The math was subtle. Competent. Criminal. The systematic reduction had been happening for weeks. Not enough to trigger the automatic low-dose alarms. Not enough to show up as obvious neglect in the charts. But enough. Exactly enough to keep a man's brain from ever crossing the threshold back into wakefulness. Dr. Ashford wasn't trying to kill the Admiral. He was trying to keep him asleep forever. Elena's jaw clenched once, then released. She had survived court-martials and parking lot humiliations and transfer notices. This was different. This was calculated sabotage of a patient who couldn't defend himself. This was the kind of violation that existed in a space beyond hospital protocol, beyond chain of command. This was why she'd been transferred. This was what they'd wanted to prevent. She pulled up the medication cabinet on her secured access, a system designed for controlled substances, every access logged, every gram accounted for. Elena moved through the screens with the precision of someone who'd spent for years managing battlefield pharmacology at Forward Operating Base Shank. The experimental stimulant combination existed in the system, locked behind restricted access that only trauma surgeons and senior intensivists could theoretically reach. Elena had been neither for 2 years. But her credentials, buried in the old system, still carried the override codes from her medical discharge. She accessed the protocol, transcranial magnetic stimulation paired with 4,4-methylamphetal, the compound they'd used in Bagram on soldiers with catastrophic TBI cases who showed signs of locked-in syndrome. The combination was brutal. It worked by flooding the synaptic receptors with stimulation that bordered on cellular trauma itself. The idea was to shock the brain back into consciousness through a controlled cascade of neurological stress. It was the kind of procedure that looked insane on paper and worked because the alternative was permanent coma. Elena prepared the foredrip with hands that moved on their own, muscle memory from 1,000 midnight shifts in the combat hospital, when she'd been Major Martinez instead of just another nurse. The needle went in smoothly at the foreport. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was a luxury for people with options. The first dose entered the Admiral's bloodstream at 3:24 a.m. Elena watched the monitors. Nothing. Then a tremor across the EEG. Then another. The brain activity began to climb, its small spikes at first, then larger ones. The amplitude increased. The frequency accelerated. At 3:31 a.m., the Admiral's brain activity spiked to a level it hadn't reached since before the court-martial that had buried both their careers. Elena stepped back from the bedside. Her hands were steady. The monitors glowed in the darkness like evidence. She pulled her phone and opened the electronic medical record, her fingers moving through the documentation system. She logged the intervention under a generic entry, neurological stimulation protocol adjusted, patient tolerance improved, continuing current regimen. She backdated the timestamp by 6 hours, placing the modification squarely during Dr. Ashford's shift, making it look like a decision he'd made and then failed to document. The falsification was clean. Necessary. A violation that would protect her and destroy him if anyone looked carefully enough. But they would look. They would find the discrepancy between the timestamp and the actual physiological response. They would trace the experimental drug signature in the Admiral's bloodstream back to the restricted access log. And that log would show Elena Martinez accessing medication at 3:24 a.m. on a Tuesday night, exactly when a patient showed improvement after weeks of decline. She documented one final note: patient tolerating stimulation protocol well. No adverse cardiac events. Brain activity climbing steadily. Recommend continuation. Then she stepped away from the bedside and walked to the nurse's station, where the night shift supervisor was reviewing charts at a desk that glowed in the darkness. Elena moved like a woman who had nothing left to lose, which was accurate. She had already been fired. Her badge had been deactivated. Security had escorted her through the loading dock with her scrubs folded in a paper bag. Her nursing license was under review by the state board. The only thing left was the truth, and the truth was locked inside a comatose admiral who might never wake up. She clocked out at 4:38 a.m., 20 minutes before her shift was supposed to end. The supervisor didn't look up from his charts. Elena walked past the staff entrance and out into the Norfolk pre-dawn, where the humidity hung like a living thing and her car sat alone in the parking lot. The sky was still dark. The hospital behind her was already beginning to wake up, early morning surgeries prepping, night shift giving report to the day shift, monitors beeping in synchrony across 50 rooms. By 6:15 a.m., Dr. Ashford would arrive for his morning rounds and discover that the Admiral's brain activity had climbed to a level that indicated a genuine neurological response. By 6:48 a.m., he would review the medication logs and see the timestamp of Elena's access. By 7:13 a.m., his phone would be in his hand, and the first call would be to hospital administration. Elena drove out of the parking lot without looking back at the building. The roads were empty. The sun was starting to stain the horizon in shades of orange and pink. She had violated protocol. She had administered experimental medications without authorization. She had falsified timestamps in the medical record. She had committed 3 separate felonies in service of saving a man who had destroyed her career in Bagram 2 years ago. And she had done it with the calm precision of a major who understood that some rules existed to protect the institution, not the patient. Some rules were designed to be broken by people willing to pay the cost. The morning sun climbed higher over Norfolk as Elena drove toward a future that no longer included her name on an employee roster or a badge hanging from a lanyard or a hospital where anyone remembered her as anything more than the unstable veteran they'd transferred to psychiatric. She had become invisible again. She had become the shadow in the system. She had become the last thing a man who thought he was untouchable would ever expect, a nurse with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. 3 days later, Admiral Vincent Cross would open his eyes for the first time. 72 hours of Elena's violation working through his nervous system, stimulating pathways that had lain dormant for 2 years. His voice would be raw from the ventilator, barely a whisper. He would speak a single word, the call sign of the major who had saved his life once in Bagram and saved it again in the darkness of room 347. And everything would change. But in this moment, at 4:53 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Elena was simply a woman driving through an empty city, her hand steady on the wheel, her future uncertain, her violation complete. The quietest person in the room had just lit the match. And nobody had even heard her strike it. The spike appeared on the monitor at 3:48 a.m. Dr. Ashford stood in the observation room, watching the Admiral's brain activity climb in real time, and his entire body went rigid. Not because the patient was waking up. Because he knew exactly what had caused it. The blood work came back 17 minutes later. Experimental neurochemical compound. Classified military-grade stimulant. The kind of thing you didn't administer without authorization from 3 different chains of command. The kind of thing that would be flagged instantly by anyone who knew what they were looking for. Dr. Ashford knew what he was looking for. He left the hospital at 4:15 a.m., his shoes clicking against the wet parking lot, rain drumming on the asphalt like a countdown. He sat in his Mercedes with the engine running and made the first call at 4:23 a.m. The hospital administrator answered on the 3rd ring, already awake, already listening. "We have a serious problem," Dr. Ashford said, his voice steady, rehearsed. Former military staff member. Major Elena Martinez. She administered unauthorized experimental compounds to Admiral Cross without any physician order. Neurochemical substances I can't even identify. She's trying to play doctor with classified protocols. The administrator's breathing changed. The hook was set. The second call went to the state nursing board at 4:38 a.m., routed to an emergency contact because it was still dark outside and the world was still asleep and nobody would question a desperate physician reporting a safety crisis. "I need to report dangerous conduct," Dr. Ashford said. His voice had changed now, tinged with concern instead of fury. Concern was more effective. "We have a former military staff member, unstable background, possible PTSD. She's exhibiting signs of military grandeur delusion, convinced she's still in combat, that her job is to make medical decisions that override attending physicians." He paused. "Let that sink in. She's already administered unauthorized drugs. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." The third call came at 5:02 a.m., this one to his colleague at the Navy Medical Review Board, the one who owed him 3 favors from a malpractice settlement 5 years ago. "I'm concerned about a former major on our nursing staff," Dr. Ashford said, his tone now paternal, protective. "She's showing signs of unraveling. Thinks she's still in theater. Thinks she has authority over treatment protocols. Today she administered an experimental compound without orders. Tomorrow, who knows what she'll do." By 5:36 a.m., before Elena's shift even officially ended, the narrative was already spreading through 3 separate institutional channels. Hospital Administration, State Board, Navy Systems. Each phone call carefully calibrated. Each story fractionally different but consistent in the essentials. A woman. A veteran. Unstable. Unauthorized. Dangerous. Delusional. The words would travel faster than truth ever could. Elena clocked out at 6:15 a.m., exhausted and numb from the adrenaline crash, from knowing that what she'd done had been right and illegal simultaneously. She went through the staff entrance where she'd entered 3 weeks ago, where the night supervisor had nodded at her and nobody had known who she was. This morning, the security guard didn't make eye contact. That was the first warning. She collected her badge from her locker at 6:27 a.m., already pulling it out of habit, already moving through the motions of a normal morning until she swiped it at the time clock and heard the soft electronic rejection. A red light instead of green. She tried again. Same sound. Same red light. Her hands didn't shake. They just stopped moving. A hospital security officer appeared at 6:51 a.m., the kind of appearance that had clearly been orchestrated, timed perfectly to coincide with her arrival. "Ms. Martinez, your access has been revoked. You need to come with me." Not a request. It was a command wrapped in professional language, and she recognized the difference immediately because she'd been giving orders like that for 12 years. She followed him to her locker. Another security officer was already there, already emptying her belongings into a clear plastic bin. Her extra scrubs. Her stethoscope. The photograph of her unit from Bagram that she kept taped to the inside of the locker door. All of it, organized and methodical, like they were collecting evidence at a crime scene. "Your employment has been terminated effective immediately," the first officer said, reading from his phone. "You're to leave the premises and have no contact with patients, staff, or hospital property." The words came at her in order, each one a separate blow, but her jaw didn't clench. Her breathing didn't change. She accepted the plastic bin filled with her life. She walked down the corridor where she'd saved lives for 3 weeks. Where she'd held her composure while the entire hospital whispered about her. Where she'd known more about Admiral Cross's medical crisis than the senior physician managing his case. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, that particular hospital hum that was somehow both sterile and suffocating. She didn't stop at the employee lounge. Didn't stop at the break room. Moved directly toward the laundry room where she'd spent her lunch break sitting in the corner, reading old medical journals and pretending the world made sense. The laundry room was empty. 6:58 a.m. on a Thursday morning, and the room was silent except for the soft hiss of the dryer finishing its cycle. She sat down on the bench in front of the folding table and removed her scrubs from the dryer. The fabric was still warm. She folded each piece methodically. Top to bottom. Left to right. The way she'd been trained to fold field tarps in the field hospital at Bagram when there were casualties and you folded your own equipment because there was no one else to do it. Pants first. Sleeves tucked in tight. The blue fabric formed perfect geometric shapes in her hands. She'd worn these scrubs through 3 weeks of her new life. 3 weeks of being nobody. 3 weeks of keeping her head down and her mouth shut and her hands steady while a man lay comatose in a room she'd walked past 140 times. She'd given him his life back. She'd administered the one compound that could spike his neural activity in a comatose brain, the one protocol that her hands remembered from a field hospital with no electricity and no backup and only her own combat training standing between a room full of wounded soldiers and death. And now he was waking up. And now she was alone in a laundry room at 7:04 a.m., folding scrubs that still smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner, and the weight of starting over pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Not the court-martial weight. Not the discharge weight. This was different. This was the weight of having something and losing it. This was the weight of knowing she'd done the right thing and no one would ever believe her. This was the weight of understanding that the same man she'd tried to save, the same admiral whose life was now burning through her hands as memory and muscle and the ghost of something she used to be, had already decided to let her burn. She finished folding the last piece of fabric. Placed it on top of the stack. The scrubs were perfectly folded. The stack was perfectly neat. The bench in the laundry room was exactly where she'd sat 3 weeks ago during her first lunch break, thinking about fresh starts and second chances and the possibility that maybe nobody here would ever have to know what she'd been. 3 days passed. Elena didn't answer calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Didn't check her email. Didn't open the official-looking envelope that arrived at her apartment bearing the seal of the Virginia State Board of Nursing. She existed in a kind of suspended animation, in a small furnished apartment that didn't feel like home, in a city that suddenly felt very large and very empty. The internet carried stories now. Stories about an unstable veteran who'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial. Stories about unauthorized drug use. Stories that had already taken root in the institutional soil and were growing into something that might never come out. Her phone rang at 7:23 p.m. on the third day. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then something shifted. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was the way the air changed when something important was about to happen. She answered. The voice on the other end was weak, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of authority like a physical thing. Is this Major Elena Martinez? The room stopped. The world stopped. Nothing moved except the muscles in her throat as she tried to form words. This is Admiral Vincent Cross. The words came out soft, damaged by 2 years of disuse, but absolutely clear. I opened my eyes this morning. First person I asked for was you. They said you don't work here anymore. They said you were fired. A pause. The sound of a heart monitor beeping in the background. I need you to know something. Whatever they told you, whatever they're saying, none of it matters now. Elena didn't breathe. Didn't move. Just listened as the Admiral continued. We have a lot to discuss, Major. And there are people who are going to be very interested in what you know. People who have been waiting a very long time for me to wake up. The call lasted 7 minutes. By the time it ended, Elena's hands were shaking for the first time in 3 weeks. Not from fear. From recognition. From understanding that the universe had just shifted on its axis and she was about to find out exactly how much of her past was about to collide with her present. The Admiral's final words echoed in her ear as she sat in her empty apartment. Get some rest, Major. Tomorrow, you're getting your life back. And we're going to burn everyone who tried to take it. If you're enjoying this, smash that like button. And answer me this, would you have signed the NDA and taken the money, or fought back? Comments are open.